Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're continuing our series comparing World of Tanks and War Thunder. While we've gone over movement and shooting, there are of course additional ways to damage enemy vehicles like ramming. In World of Tanks, you can ram enemy vehicles to do additional damage and potentially break the enemy's tracks. And while speed is definitely a factor, the most important factor in determining how much damage you deal or take during a ram is actually the difference in mass between you and your opponent. For example, if an ELC even 90 were to fly at full speed into the side of a mouse, the mouse would barely take any damage and the ELC even 90 would be destroyed. Conversely, if the mouse were simply to brush past the ELC even 90, the ELC even 90 would take fairly considerable damage and the mouse wouldn't take anything. There is of course also a physics engine, so pushing enemies off of cliffs or into water is always a fun and interesting way to land kills, although obviously that is somewhat setup dependent. War Thunder doesn't really have ramming damage, although it does have a form of crushing damage, but in order to inflict this you have to be significantly heavier than your opponent and you usually have to shove them against something like a wall, so while it is technically possible, it's pretty rare. Of course, you can still shove enemies off of a cliff, however it doesn't really do anything, and you can shove them into water to try and drown them, however if they are amphibious you will be somewhat disappointed in the result. Now we've talked about how you move and how you shoot enemies, so let's go into how you find enemies to shoot. And for World of Tanks, they actually have a dedicated spotting system. The spotting system is actually relatively straightforward. If your spotting range is 400 meters and the enemy has a 25% camo, you will spot them at 300 meters. Of course, all of that is only the starting point for the World of Tanks spotting system. Moving will reduce your camouflage, firing your gun will significantly reduce your camouflage. You can also hide in bushes to increase your camouflage. Additionally, hiding in a bush and firing your gun will cause that bush to temporarily go transparent, so it won't count for your camouflage unless you fire it from far enough behind the bush that it's not actually within the radius to make it transparent. And of course, if you get within 50 meters of the enemy, you will automatically spot them even if there is something like a building in the way. As you can probably tell, there's a lot of modifiers to this system that can make it a little difficult to get your head around. There's also what's called a render distance, which is 550 meters. If the enemy is outside of that render distance, you won't see the enemy even if they are spotted by you or a teammate. This does bring us to the subject of spotting assistance. Generally, this will be done by light tanks, but any vehicle in the game can get credit for spotting assistance by spotting an enemy that is not spotted by the person that is firing their gun. So if your light tank is well in front of you and is spotting an enemy for you, they will also get credit when you hit the enemy with one of your shells. Now, enemies that aren't spotted or are outside of the render distance are still hittable by you. You're still firing physical projectiles that can hit them, however they are obviously invisible and thus quite difficult to hit, but certainly not impossible. You'll probably also notice me using the camera zoom out feature a lot. In World of Tanks, you can zoom the camera out pretty far to try and get a good idea of the lay of the land and exactly where everything is in relation to everything else, which is a pretty handy feature to have. Teams in World of Tanks, especially on large wide open maps, can absolutely make or break on the skill or lack thereof of their various scouts. In World of Tanks, all crews currently come with the Sixth Sense ability. What the Sixth Sense ability does is when you are spotted, you will get an audio cue and see a little light bulb. This means that the enemy can currently see you. However, there is a 3-second delay between when you are spotted and when this actually triggers, and if you're suitably exposed, 3 seconds can be more than enough for multiple enemies to team shot you and take you out. In War Thunder, it works a little different. While you can scout enemies on the minimap, you don't do so in the same fashion you do in World of Tanks. Instead, only light tanks have the ability to highlight enemies by using the active scouting feature, either while in the gunner's view or in the commander's binocular view. When they do this, the enemy will stay highlighted for a while and their position will be updated in real time for the rest of your team. However, unlike in World of Tanks, the enemies aren't invisible just because they aren't scouted. You can still physically see them with your eyes. Enemies will also be highlighted on your minimap if they are shot at by a teammate, or alternatively if they get too close to one of the spawn zones. That being said, maintaining awareness of the situation around you usually requires using both audio and visual cues in War Thunder. The third-person camera, using it to peek around corners or over hills, is very important. Additionally, having good directional audio is very useful in the game and can be vital if you're in a close quarters environment. That being said, War Thunder does have some consistency issues, especially at longer ranges with vehicle pop-in, and at close range you can have some issues with audio if a vehicle approaches you faster than it renders the audio. So all in all, while you can help provide vision for your team in War Thunder, you will have to rely a lot on both your own eyes and your own ears to find enemies. That being said, you will frequently see me in War Thunder checking the scoreboard, both to see how many tickets both sides have and to see how many active vehicles are left in the match. In World of Tanks, you can actually enable a lot of toggles on the minimap to show you last known enemy positions, last known enemy health bar, etc, etc. So World of Tanks is a little better at presenting the information to the player at a glance. Of course, now that we have all of that out of the way, how do you actually win a game? In World of Tanks, there are actually 3 different variations of game you can play. One of them is where both teams have a capture point, one of them is where there is a single neutral capture point, and the last one is an attacker-defender scenario. Of note, in World of Tanks, there are no respawns, and destroying the entire enemy team will also cause you to win the game. However, if the game goes to time and you're not playing the attacker-defender scenario, the game will automatically end in a draw. But in the attacker-defender scenario, if the game does go to time, it will automatically go to the defender. Of note, in World of Tanks, capturing a zone results in the immediate end of the match, or not quite immediate. There's actually a delay of several seconds after you capture a zone, but before the game actually ends, and this also gives the enemy a chance to either A, destroy your last tank, or B, capture your zone themselves. This can lead to more draws than it really should, and I'm not sure why you would put a feature like this that enables more draws in the game. It just seems like a very odd choice to me. Notably, with zone caps, it does take a while to capture a zone, and taking damage will reset your portion of the cap. On top of that, if the enemy is also on the capture point, you will then stop capture progress, so it can be very difficult to do while the enemy is still alive. It's also notable that the attacker-defender scenarios uses a completely different setup from the other 2 scenarios. So instead of going essentially lengthwise, you now go widthwise, and a lot of the maps really weren't designed to be played in this fashion, so it does really change the map dynamics in a way that isn't always positive. On the whole, I found the vast majority of World of Tanks games were going to kills, not caps, simply because capturing the zone took too long and was too easily interrupted, whereas taking out the enemy was fairly easy, especially as the games did tend to snowball a bit as you started to get a pretty substantial advantage. War Thunder also has 3 common game modes, although they do function pretty differently than how they do in World of Tanks. You have a 1 cap, a 2 cap, and a 3 cap. The 1 cap and the 3 cap both essentially work on the same principle, wherein if you control more capture points than the enemy team, you will start bleeding away their tickets. Additionally, destroying enemy vehicles takes away 100 tickets as well, so a combination of capture points and destroying the enemies will result in the enemy slowly losing tickets until you ultimately win. And now is a good time to bring up the spawn system in War Thunder. When you drop into a match in War Thunder, you have 450 spawn points to spend on vehicles. Heavy tanks and tanks at the high end of the battle rating range you're playing cost more spawn points, whereas anti-airs, tank destroyers, and tanks at the lower end tend to cost less. As long as you have the spawn points, you can keep spawning in vehicles, although vehicles of the same type do start to get progressively more expensive the more time you spawn them. Spawning additional vehicles will consume spawn points, but doing useful actions such as destroying enemies, capturing points, getting assists, etc. will also give you spawn points. Because of this, while it is technically possible to run the enemy completely out of spawns to the point where you just win, it is actually fairly uncommon. Now you'll notice I haven't mentioned the 2 capture point yet, and that's because it works very differently from the other 2. In the 2 capture point setup, both teams start with control of their own point, and the enemy has to take control of it. And once the enemy takes control of it, they essentially automatically win, which of course makes this game mode feel very reminiscent of playing World of Tanks. Interestingly enough, in the last update, they did add another caveat that you could use to win the game, that was by getting 60 enemy kills. However, even with this additional win condition, these maps still go to time far more often than the other 2. Whenever a map goes to time in War Thunder, whether it be 1, 2, or 3 cap, the winner is always the team with the most tickets left when the time runs out. The combination of these factors means it's fairly difficult to run the enemy team completely out of vehicles, so 9 times out of 10 games in War Thunder will go down to a combination of tickets from zone caps and kills, or in the case of the 2 cap map, will actually go down to whoever has the most tickets left remaining at the end of the timer. One could easily look at War Thunder's more sluggish and authentic features versus World of Tanks' more arcadey gameplay and think that World of Tanks is a very fast-paced game, whereas War Thunder is a much slower and more methodical game, in which case prepare to have your mind blown because it's actually kind of the other way around. I would broadly characterize World of Tanks as a methodical team-based game, somewhat in the veins of something like Overwatch or League of Legends. The objective is always to do what is best for your team in a given moment, whether it be holding a lane, scouting the enemy, or providing fire support to your teammates. And the big reason for this is the time to kill, or TTK. The TTK in World of Tanks, the time from which you land your first shot and do damage to the enemy to the time in which you destroy them, in a one-on-one duel is around 30 seconds to a minute. which makes it very impractical for you to try to take on enemies one-on-one, and much more practical to try and take out enemies or for them to take out you using team shots. Now, a long TTK in a game does two things. Number one, it means that generally speaking in a one-on-one fight, the better player will come out on top. A long TTK favors prolonged accuracy and landing multiple shots over a period of time versus just getting lucky once. The downside to a long TTK is fairly straightforward. It's actually very difficult to take on multiple enemies at the same time. If you get caught in part of the map on your own and the enemies were to realize this and two of them were to push you at the same time, if they have double the hit points and double the damage per minute, you're probably going to lose that fight no matter how good you are unless you have some kind of overwhelming advantage against them. This also combines with the spotting system, wherein many of the tanks that can do a lot of the frontline fighting aren't great at spotting enemies without getting seen themselves. And the tanks that are really good at spotting the enemy and not getting spotted are generally not that efficient in terms of dealing with the enemy. In this respect, the dynamic and individual elements of World of Tanks often boil down to trying to extend the vision of your team to enable your long-range shooters to land shots, or trying to use your heavy armor to push up to the next corner, or alternatively trying to set up your long-range gun in a better flanking position so you can shoot around the enemy's cover. It always happens in context of your team, it's never done in a vacuum. While the team-based element can feel amazing when it's working and everybody's firing on all cylinders, it can also be incredibly frustrating if you get stuck on a big long-range map and all of your light tanks are fighting to share that one single brain cell they got. War Thunder, on the other hand, is more of a dynamic and individual game along the lines of Call of Duty, and a lot of this feel comes from the very short TTK in War Thunder, wherein basically every tank in the game can be taken out with a single well-placed shot. This also means pulling off a successful flank will mean taking out enemies basically on reload, and you can roll up the entire flank on yourself if you're good enough and quick enough about it, as you can frequently take out multiple enemies before the second or third one even knows you're there. An obvious downside to a very fast TTK is that enemies can also kill you very fast if there's an enemy that you didn't see or that's hiding in a corner. However, to some extent this is mitigated by having a system with multiple respawns, so just because you missed one enemy doesn't mean you're out of the match, you're just out of that one vehicle. And obviously, even if two enemies do shoot you, all this really means is that you have to bounce one of their shots or absorb it, and then you can effectively take out both of them. Much like how World of Tanks does have dynamic and individual elements, there are of course methodical and team-based elements to War Thunder, but they do take a bit of a secondary role compared to simply being able to land your shots and make relatively quick decisions on your own. This ability to clear out one or more enemies in relatively quick succession does also contribute to War Thunder having a more dynamic map environment, whereas World of Tanks tends to take a while to progress from one part of the map to the next, just because of how many shots it will take to wipe out a given enemy. Now, I didn't make the comparison to Call of Duty idly. In the game Call of Duty, if you go on a long enough kill streak, you can earn a nuke, and dropping the nuke will immediately end the match. In War Thunder, you can go on a long enough kill streak and earn a nuclear bomber if you're at battle rating 6.7 or higher. This nuclear bomber will spawn at the airfield and you have to fly it all the way to the ground battlefield and drop the bomb. However, if you can do this, your team will automatically win no matter what the scoreboard looks like or whatever shape your team is in. And for me, the ability to simply play out of your mind and drag your team across the finish line, whether they want to or not, is actually one of the big defining factors that really differentiates the moment-to-moment feel of these two games. And that wraps up our video for today. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And of course, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss out on the next video in the series, because we do of course still have a lot more to go over, such as researching, monetization, etc. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.